Okay, great. We're now we're recording. Great. Hi everyone. This is a episode of East is a Podcast bonus feed. I'm gonna put this in front of the on it's gonna be available on YouTube. So it's kind of like a faux paywall. I've been doing that a lot lately. So I'm excited to have this conversation. A listener put me onto your article, um, Iker Suarez, and it's an extremely depressing article, but it gave me a lot of food for thought about the state of things and how the genocide, the ongoing genocide against this class of people called migrants, that really is like it's become this kind of background noise of this neoliberal world. Please introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about yourself, and what brought you about this article, and then we can sort of dive into the piece itself.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I'm Iker Suarez. I'm a PhD student in CUNY, City University of New York. I do stuff on immigration, and that's kind of like my job at the moment. And I also have been organizing for a long time, both currently in the US with CUNY for Palestine, which is currently being repressed quite heavily. Several comrades, and also, in Spain, I've done anti-detention work and other just organizing work there. And so the piece really comes to it comes out of a process of dealing with the constant stream of massacres on European shores, and that this happens year after year. And I'm currently in Calais, and just yesterday, a migrant called Saeed died on his way to the UK here in the Channel. So it's happening every day, right? And so it's after a while trying to come to terms with this as a reality that we cannot reduce to sort of a moral tragedy, right? It's something that we have to come to terms with analytically. What does this mean for the analysis of our societies, and therefore for how we struggle in our particular social formations, right? And I think, in a way, this was the main driver. We have to name this constant massacre that is going on every day, and it's not in the news, and it's not sort of so obvious. We have to name it in a way that allows it to be center stage in our analysis, and allows it not to be written out, right? And so I think what happens a lot here in Europe is that class analysis tends to omit these things, or tends to downplay them, right? And so I think the framing of it as genocidal pressure is a way to really try to anchor this as a central reality that cannot be dismissed or forgotten, which a lot of European and Eurocentric Marxisms will do and continue to do, right? And so I think this is kind of like the element. Let's frame this in the center.
Yeah, no, this and your article gave me a lot of it recalled a lot of stuff that I had sort of scratched the surface on in my own work in my long time ago dissertation, and where I was kind of interested in the early history of the sort of rise of refugees as like a legal category. It's like a juridical subject, and the strange trajectory that it's taken. It's been about 100 years now that we've had this language, a bit more, um, is how obviously, like, the dehumanization continues. Obviously, racism is still around. Obviously, like, all the things that were a factor back then are still a factor now. But for me, what makes so scary about our current moment, I guess, at the overall, and really, we should get into actually the article itself before I do this. I mean, I wanted to bring this up as just kind of like a question, is that, like, the seas used to be a place of refuge, right? They used to be a place you would go to be invisible. Now, it's a dangerous place, mind you. It's a dangerous place that can take your life, but if you were well equipped and if you had the proper setup, then you could leave the place you were and go someplace anew. I'm realizing now, in your article, it sort of underscores this to me, even in the background, is that there is an entire industrial surveillance and murder army that has constructed multiple sea walls, invisible sea walls, that you know, are that's so insane to think about that they can watch more than likely they can watch every square inch of the sea live and they can have it viewed for them and they can mark whoever is coming in. I mean, I don't know if that's the actual case because people do still land. Obviously, like people still come. So I don't think it's like all encompassing, but like I could have never imagined that even 10 years ago, although probably 10 years ago it was probably starting or it was probably around then that like drones and like the sort of the eternal eye of this panopticon, of this insane border panopticon regime that like Europe is like the first front on and like the southern border of the US is like a second. But yeah, it's crazy. I mean, so just at the beginning, like I wanted to kind of raise that, but really, let's get into the actual sort of article because there was a line towards the end of the conclusion that this because the wider backdrop of the actual story sort of became clear. It said the migrant genocide is the ghost that haunts European politics. It is the irrepressible backdrop against which immigration, the defining issue of European societies, unfolds. So like this, for me, I realized that like this is something that America and like Europe and Canada too, to a degree, and also Australia and a lot of the white settler colonies share that this obsession with immigration, with the crossing of national borders, according to some sort of like, you know, this is some holy crime. So that for me, I think that, especially being where I live, that like most of that panic is in the US here. In Canada, there is very little border panic. It's in the abstract. Actually, I take that back. There is border panic, but it's a view of, oh, the legal immigration is the problem. I mean, mind you, I'm sure that is part of the border panic of the US, but it is functionally different. I probably, in fact, should do should do an episode about it. But really, it's interesting is that in Europe, this really is the defining issue for all of them. Like nothing unites Europeans the way that fear of the southern migrant does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's the issue. You're seeing it also in the US. It's the perhaps the defining issue of electoral politics in the imperial core today, right? It's what's like swings elections one way or another. We've seen it. We're seeing it with Trump in the U.S., but also 2024 we had European elections here, and there was a rightward turn, which was brought on the heels of the migrant question, right? Immigration. And so I think when we think about those things, we think about, immigrants already on European land. Like, what do we do with those immigrants, right? And fascists will say, you have to deport them. You have to, basically ethnically cleanse these populations to keep Europe white or to keep the settler colony white. However, I think when I say, the ghost is that this is prior to that, right? Like all of European politics. And I want to be clear, like this piece is about Europe. I don't want to generalize to the core. I'm analyzing sort of my context, and I don't want to make, sweeping sort of generalizations. But all of those politics, all of that main issue that like really decides elections and the direction of our societies is the backdrop to that is people dying every day, being killed every day at sea, right? And here I want to bring up one of the figures I cite in the article. Just to Spain, so I'm from Spain. In 2024, 10,000 people died in 1 year. 10,000 people died on the way to Spain. In 2025, just until the end of May, around 2,000 people have died. That's around 2 people per hour. 2 people per hour, right? Per day. That's a lot, right? And so when we think about immigration, about far right parties, we don't think about these things, but this is really what's behind it. Like this is what undergirds all of the discourse, which is that they're massacring people all the time. And to go back to your point about like the panopticon surveillance element, it's interesting because if we talk about like militarization of Europe, right, which is one of the main topics nowadays, because they're like rearming Europe and all of these things. The vanguard of that sort of movement, of that tendency, is the border, right? And so this is why Frontex, which is ICE in Europe, a pan-European force, is one building an army that is 10,000 of 10,000 people. And then it's also the agency within the European Union with the largest budget, and it's grown exponentially, right? Like you can literally see, the graphs that make it grow exponentially. And this is an agency that has its own drones, its own ships, its own weapons. And all of this is kind of like the threat that, not threat, that's how it's construed, that kind of like leads the militarizing drive in the European context, because on the sort of conventional military front, we've been so far under the NATO US military umbrella, but not for immigration. And so that's where really this begins. And I think, it is very, they have drones and they can kind of like see most inches of the sea. But I think something that, is also good to look at is the fact that this is still irrepressible, right? Like there's no way, however much you invest, that you can truly dominate the sea like they want to dominate it, or the routes to Europe. And that's one of the problems they have, right? Like that's, it's not, you can be as militaristic as you want and then you solved it. You're not going to be able to solve it, right? And so the sea, despite having become, one of the main sort of crime scenes of, neocolonialism, right, of European neocolonialism, it still bears sort of, points that are not easily resolvable for Europe and its liberal sort of self-perception, veneer, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah.
So let's get into some of the facts and figures around this, because the one you quoted is, that's something else. You quoted a couple about just from the Spanish side, and but remember that's like that's like the official count too. God knows how many people die like invisible deaths, but also that like there is this infrastructure of NGOs who monitor this stuff pretty closely. And I follow a bunch of them, and I've seen their reach is very small. Like they have the same problem that a ton of sort of activist NGOs in Europe face, which is an indifferent public, right? And so my question, I guess, is, is this in the way that the U.S. is kind of is the contradictions of American whiteness and American settler colonialism are resolved through the spectacle of the migrant being trafficked back and forth, being policed, incarcerated, but also like and is that also pulling Europe together as a project? Because so little unites Europe. It's certainly not a united economic entity. It certainly doesn't have any linguistic or cultural base to it. So other than like Schengen, and a bunch of like corporate agreements that like help launder, whatever, like goods and services between certain class of elites. Like what else do Europeans have? Like other than this stuff?
Right. Yeah, no, I think you're getting right to it. I think the point of Frontex, the European Union is supposed to be something that is created for peace, to keep peace, right? And so if we read it historically, Europe had always been, the inter-imperialist sort of struggles, wars, et cetera, et cetera. And European Union is a project to kind of counter that by, integration of bourgeoisies and all of that. But the fact that Frontex becomes the first actual coordinated armed force, I think, is very much a signal of how the migrant question is cohering European whiteness, right? Which is a whiteness that is, it's textured in a way, like there's different sort of levels within it, but it's still very much being cohered, I think, by the existence of Frontex and by the existence of this structural sort of genocide that we see at sea, right? And so I think, in a way, it's kind of like Europe's formation is maturing into a higher level of coherence, just as the settler colonial projects do, right? Like they have different sort of, if you will, shades of whiteness that then get incorporated into sort of like a bigger project of just white conquest, enslavement, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this is bringing it to Europe, even though, I think the contradictions are, or like the incoherences are still there. So, yeah.
So one thing that's like also escapes me in the logic of this is that like the war on this class of people, and that's partly, this is a question around this, is that we don't typically talk about genocide in class terms, we typically use we think of it as a kind of racialized religious nationalist project, and one that like the work that is sort of that has a sort of mixed class character to it. So in the case of German, Italian, all kinds of American fascism, for instance, like it's a pan class movement. But in the case of this genocide, of this class, like the migrant is a new class of legal subject, or at least in this way, or it's a new. I mean, there's always been outsiders. There's always been racialized panic. That's not something new. But I would say, though, is that in this current configuration, though, is that the contradiction that sort of this like really insurgent racism faces is that their own project doesn't have the numbers of human laborers to sustain themselves. That like all of the countries, especially the southern countries of Europe, face insane cartoonishly low birth rates to the point where you have to make the obvious analogy, which is Children of Men was a documentary. Like that's like where we are, that like the truth be told, that like the response to it seems to be that like one of the crises of Europe is like this lack of, I don't know, a reason to be of their youth. I mean, you tell me, you're a youth of Europe. Do you have a reason to procreate and continue this European project? Or is it like a lot of those, especially in the global north, life is so unaffordable, life is so, like contingent and whatever, that you're like, well, kids, forget kids. I'm not gonna like, I can barely keep myself going. So like this is, it's a question because, that laboring class is needed. The same thing that's true of the US is true of Europe. That's a laboring class. Those African, Middle Eastern, like Kurdish, Turkish, like whoever class of migrants who are flowing in from all directions, that's their labor pool. That is the reserve army that capitalism needs. And so one point that you bring my attention to is that the sort of the kind of neoliberal culling of this class is part of it, like maintaining a certain, like the way that you would maintain like a large herd of cattle, that imperialists don't mind slaughtering a bunch if it makes the price more stable. And so can we talk a little bit about the labor dimension of this migrant crisis? Because Europeans like literally would stop like having life. I mean, Americans are watching it happen now, that their way of life is grinding to a halt because the rampant racism of their political class and their media class whipping up this frenzy. And so I wonder, how do Europeans sort of view this, or what is the sort of debate around this, of this obvious contradiction?
Yeah, well, I think the contradiction is there. There's no way that like Spain is a good example, right? There's no way that European societies can sustain themselves and their sort of standards of living, the conditions for their labor aristocracy, which is welfare and all of that, without the inflow of migrants, right? And so this is something that they have to come to terms with. And I think there's kind of, two solutions to this. One is the social democratic solution to it, which is you do allow some migrants in, and you kind of avoid the more fascistic or fascist leaning panic. And with it, you very much, super exploit those migrants to sustain that very labor aristocracy and maintain social peace as the European core has for the past 75 years. So that's one solution, still obviously entirely imperialist. The other solution is one that responds more to this panic, where does not really have that strategic outlook of like, oh, we need to keep some people in order to like keep the whites happy, essentially. And so it's a more short-term situation, or more short-term analysis or calculus that deals with that, right? And so I think the labor component of this, and I don't know if perhaps I'm jumping ahead, but I think when you talk about the reserve army of labor, right, I think the reserve army of labor is something that we have to see, and it's one of my, I guess, main emphasis here, is that labor reserves, as capitalism develops historically, are sort of mapped onto core and periphery in very different ways, right? And so the way this is done is basically, because a labor reserve is a dangerous thing to have if you're trying to keep social peace, right? Because it's people that have no stakes in the system and that can essentially rise up and question everything, right? And so the way this happens throughout sort of the development of imperialism is that labor reserves are exported in a way to the periphery. And by being exported, you create the sort of developmental and social peace outcomes that you need in the core, right? Which is really, where you can lose the war very much so, because these proletarians really live close to you, and so you export that and you export those problems, which is kind of in the piece I use Kwame Nkrumah's sort of analysis of neocolonialism as, the export of those contradictions, right? And so I think immigration here and the border politics of all of this is a sort of pressure valve. Samir Amin actually uses this exact sort of way of putting it. It's a pressure valve, right? And you allow in the people that you need to allow in, while maintaining sort of a level that is not, there's no sort of insurrectional pressure, right? Which is what some authors like Parisieros talk about the peripheries, right? And so it's kind of like an interesting arrangement there about how you regulate and kind of manage the world systemic problem of the labor reserve, of the reserve army of labor. And, Ali Kadri talks about the capital population contradiction as that which supersedes, the capital labor contradiction, or like it doesn't supersede it, but, in a way it becomes its expression. And so it's a way of modulating all of that. And I think with the piece, there's a lot of good analysis of how, the immigration and the border system within Europe and beyond, are just ways of, creating, pliable, cheap workforces. Harsha Walia, Nandita Sharma, Hannah Cross, all these people have been saying this for a while, right? You create a sort of underclass, that you can super exploit because they have less rights. It's in effect, it's a form of apartheid in this late neocolonial phase, right? Because you kind of segment the regimes of rights. Some people are citizens and some people are, illegals, right? And so the illegals have less rights and therefore you can exploit them. And, deportation, all of these things are discipline, class discipline mechanisms, which are very much mediated by race and racial panics, but they're class discipline to lower the wage floor and the exploitation of these people, which in turn, has its effects on the general population. But that's a different matter. So I think this is very well analyzed. What is less incorporated into the political economic analysis is the backdrop to this, as we were saying, which is what comes before these populations are super exploited already on European land, right? And are already disciplined like that through, apartheid-like laws. Mass killing is what comes before, right? And so that part of the mass killing is a crucial part of how capital on a world systemic scale deals and sort of addresses the problem of the labor reserves, the capital population contradiction. It's one of those. It's a very much an important way, right? And so you come to a point where the labor problem is crucial to sustain European societies, but by the sheer magnitude of what happens before, people actually working in the fields of Southern Europe, or people, working the lower paying jobs in Europe throughout. What happens before that is almost of, perhaps not of more importance, but, of equal analytical sort of weight for us to understand our context. So that's kind of what I wanted to also bring to the fore.
So then, is there and part of the violence of this system is that, as capitalists decide, or I don't know if it's an active decision, but who knows, but like when the tides turn, let's put it that way, let's use a more natural metaphor, against like foreign labor flows or like inflows or whatever, and you turn, or which is to say you turn the spigot off. When the spigot gets turned off, are those the moments where we find, like, the UKIP in the UK, or is UKIP just an opportunistic kind of spin-off of the wider crisis? Like, I guess the question is, like, which way does it go? Or is it all part of the same hysterical kind of racist economy of kind of managing and manipulating race panic, right, among European middle and upper classes. And those race panics help, like, put the lid on the any kind of, like, where class resentments or any feeling of, like, you're able to basically, like, divert the flow of people's rage away from its, like, true sources to just some, like, anonymous class of people that you can beat up and, like, kick out and watch your cops, like, rustle out into the dark in their pajamas, in, like, night raids, and you can, like, feel better about your life. But, like, I guess at a certain point, I mean, I said earlier, I realized when I was talking earlier, I had kind of made a mistake, is that, the this migrant genocide is like a class war for sure, but it does have the racialized dimension, right? Because it's certainly, and that's what actually makes it so potent as a unifying political force. It has this ability to unite all the middle classes and the working classes together, at least in those northern economies, right? Of those, like, citizenry or whatever you want to call it, in the name of, protect our land, to protect our land. So like working class people become the mechanism by which, you go and rustle up, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, look at the ICE agents. A ton of ICE agents are Latino. I mean, I don't know the stats, but it's not an insignificant number. This is not like Israel, or it's not like, the Israeli forces. I mean, the Israeli forces do have their own racialized minority system, so I should take that back, because there are the Druze, there are the Bedouin, and, like, there are, like, categories of people that they allow in who do their dirty work. And I guess in some ways, the Frontex and that class of Europeans have their own equivalent of that, right? Except they dress it up as the Libyan National Coast Guard or whatever, like a Coast Guard, right? Or, like, that's how they dress it up. But, like, we know there is no Libyan Coast Guard. It's just mercenaries who are, like, paid to, like, hunt down, and probably paid by the capture. Like, probably just, like, it's not all that different from, like, slave catchers in, like, 19th century US. Like, this is how it goes. And it's crazy. Like, it's still, and what's funny is that American liberals here, in the midst of all of this, and the American liberals here still, they get the Fell for It Again award. They still think that Europe is some social democratic paradise. Like, they still think that, Europeans are civilized. Like, libs are, like, fantasizing about moving to escape the problems of racism. It's like, bro, do you know where your own problems originated? Do you know where your, like, conceptions of race and race war and border and policing, do you know where they originated from? So it's crazy that in the midst of all this, that fiction of social democratic Europe still retains at that, like, this openly fascist, bloodthirsty society, like, just as fascist as the US, and a bunch of them too, speaking different languages, and they even have different sets of enemies, because in the Baltic states, their migrant anxiety is not from the south, it's from the east, right? Like, that's their, like, race panic. That's their, like, the big bad Russian, thing. So it's a flexible form too. Like a flexible, it's crazy, man. What Europeans have wrought in this time. I don't know. I had to tell this story. I'm sorry. I'm just wandering now because my brain goes back to this, which is like in those good years of grad school where I was funded by the Canadian government. I was doing my tour around Europe, learning languages and stuff. I did French and German, and I remember I would go around and I would be on trains in Schengen, leaving and kind of coming back into Schengen. For me, was such a surreal experience because they would give me the third degree. They would stand over me. They would just terrorize me, and nothing ever affected me because I thought it was funny. Because I was like, "What are you gonna do to me, buddy? I got a better passport than you do." I've had that first world shield around me, and I knew that it would be okay. But then, I mean, what's less funny is that you think that this is here to entrap guys who look exactly like me, who are traveling on their own, who have been pushed out of some war, probably traumatized, maybe who knows whatever else has happened to them. And you think that this is there are various nets, like out of some Disney movie of dog catchers, jumping out of vans with nets. There's so many of them. This is the whole machine of European policing now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think there's a lot there. You said a lot of things. So I'm just gonna try to take some of them. I think the about the racial and class panic, right? Or these sort of racial or class dynamics. I think in a way this kind of I guess debate between race and class is to me it's not really productive or generative, because I think in a way, like you talked about the Baltic states, right? And their racial panic being like Eastern European countries. I think race in many ways serves a political economic functions. And so here we go back to your initial point, which is how this, in particular, the migrant genocide, but the migrant sort of regulation in general, is a key form of cohering the class blocks that you have inside the nation, right? And so when you talk about Latino sort of ICE agents, this is a form of integration within the political economy of the core, even if obviously subordinate and stratified. But it is a form of integration and in a way cooptation into those structures, right? And so I think an interesting way to put it, it came as you were speaking, is the migrant question, immigration regulation, and the migrant genocide as its sort of chief form, at least in Europe, is a key way of enforcing class collaboration, right? It's a key way in which you very much violently, brutally, on an industrial scale, ensure that classes collaborate within, because outside you're just massacring people after people, right? You're leaving ships out to sink. You're doing all these things, and so in a way, this is a very much cohesive and cohering sort of mechanism. And yeah, I think one of the things that I think is, or at least I would like to convey with this piece that you mentioned, that I appreciate you bringing it up, is kind of this social democratic sort of mirage that some North Americans have about Europe, right? And I'm not saying there's no difference, like there is difference, but what I am saying is that this social democracy, is premised on, I said it before, like 2 people dying a day, 2 people are murdered a day, right? And so you talk about racial murder, lynchings in the US. This is, in a way, the reason this is more visible in the US is because this is internalized within the US formation, right? In Europe, it's sort of, pretended that it's outside and therefore more normalized. And, all these are foreigners. These are not part of, our societies. And I think for us to advance the analysis, we have to be like, no, this is a core component of our social formation, right? And that's why social democracy is a marriage, because it's still premised on all these people being massacred all the time. Not to mention, just reactionary sort of positions on national liberation all the time. Like this is just constant. And so I think it's a good sort of way of trying to be like, hey, yes, all of this social democracy that, yes, in the US you don't have, but also it's still premised on these particular things. And it's also premised on a particular geographical arrangement in which the colonized people that are being targeted are externalized, right? And so because they're still external, you can hide them a bit more and you can keep this fiction a bit more, right? And so again, you can cohere sort of the diversified class blocks within your nation, right? And I think, yeah, it's important. I think it's important to have nuance here about like, how class blocks are diversified racially and ethnically, right? And so how it's not, that capital is dynamic in that way, right? It's not, obviously there's still going to be white supremacist elements all the time in how it operates and in how it's guided. But it has an ability to, shift some things up, post-racialism, et cetera, to be able to, again, enforce those mechanisms of class collaboration.
I guess another sort of issue in all this for me is like 100 years ago, like basically now, like huge swaths of Europe were hearing the sirens call like of 2 different political forces. One was communism and the Soviet Union. I mean, not so much. Soviet Union was still kind of a mess, but it's coming, but like communism was still very much like a power on the continent, and the other one was fascism. And like you fast forward to today, it's 100 years later, basically. You know, we the era of post fascist Europe was a bit of a joke because like the Spanish, like in Spain there was literally a fascist dictatorship until like the 80s. like like until like I was alive, until I was like basically a baby, like there was still a fascist dictatorship. So fascism wasn't a problem. I mean, like even in the Japanese system, the same political elite lived through the nuclear bomb, all their crimes, and then they were reincorporated into the West, right, by the American like fascist NATO elite, right? So we all know like the Wehrmacht to NATO pipeline. So part of this sort of interesting story is that like Europe sort of open this kind of like this stage of Europe's sort of race panic around around the sort of migrant, the illegal migrant, whatever figure. So you think about it, and you think about the depth of that and where that is coming from and how it fixes so many problems for them. And then you think about the paltry state of the communist parties all across the continent, that the fascists are so strong that they like have every TV network, like a third of the political parties, basically, that like the White House, you know, like that they like won't even allow Palestine Action to exist. Like the most, you know, like straight up, like, you know, protest act, liberal thing that's like liberal friendly. Like, God forbid you do any damage to any war weapons, they're going to throw the book at you. And so, like, this strange moment that we're in, it's like there's no countervailing force against them. I mean, maybe there is. Maybe, and in fact, maybe the migrant class is part of that. It's like, I mean, this is like always been, I mean, I have my own issues here with bringing this up, but this was always the, God, what were they called? The Invisible Committee people and the insurrectionists. And I mean, I should revisit it, but I don't care, first of all, enough to do that. But like, I meant more that like for them, there was always this like X factor. There was always this like kerosene that would like light everything on fire. And that was like the urban racialized proletariat. Now, they never said that, but they would always say urban. And because they were, you know, like white Frenchmen. Of course, that's like how they think. And so like, but I can't help but think that like one of the reasons why they surveil this class of workers while there's so much intense surveillance is that these are people who could be a potential, you know, site of organization for communist sort of movements. That like these are like you have nothing to lose but your chains. And like that's the message appealing to a lot of this class of people. And so I guess what worries me is that like there's just so little for waging and all the like what do we have? The closest thing we have to communist parties in the governments of Europe are the Green parties, who are more fascistic than liberals. Like that's the closest thing we have, like in terms of like an economic policy agenda. Like that's, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I guess you could say whatever. Who's Mélenchon in France or whatever, whatever his name is, but he wasn't even allowed to take power. Like I don't know. It's pretty bleak from here, but maybe you see things different.
Yeah, so I think with the crisis, so you have a model that works very well, and it's kind of similar to the US in Europe, which is, you know, you have a bipartisan sort of, or like two-party sort of formation up until the 2008 crisis. And after that, that kind of breaks, right? And so you have the emergence of both left-wing or left-of-center parties, which kind of, you know, gather many forces from social movements that had been sort of very much marginalized. And then you have the far-right forces that gain power, right? And so you have this sort of the two-party system becomes a multi-party system. And so I think, you know, it is very important to, at least from my perspective, to understand that these left experiments, electoral experiments, are social democratic experiments. And they fundamentally believe and partake in the dream, sort of in the mirage of, you know, a social democratic Europe, a social Europe, you know. that has rights, that has worker rights, that, for example, does not, we're not gonna talk too much about the migrant question, because maybe then we realize we're not so social, right? So these are social democratic sort of experiments, which in a moment where the two-party sort of arrangement had been very much, like these things were like at some point like radical in the sense of like the discourse that they platformed and they brought into the political context, even though the program was not even close to anything communist or farther to the left of social democracy. It's just a movement of recuperation. In a way, it's interesting when you think about it. In a way, it's kind of analogous to a Make America Great Again. It's like we want social democracy again, right? And so there's no historical analysis of the evolution of capital, stagnation, economic conditions that allowed, or geopolitical conditions even, that allowed and brought social democracy. They're just like, oh, this was great, so why don't we go back to it, right? And so there's no real political economic analysis there. But I think something important to look at in those experiments is that and I like, this has been maybe 10, 12 years ago that this started happening. I also I was excited for them at some point, and it was something new. I think they've exhausted their ability to mobilize, and this is, I think, part of two things. The social democratic sort of way of explaining this is that they've been targeted very much so through lawfare, through all of these things, and this is true, right? Like Syriza in Greece, when they tried to like question the troika and like the debt situation there, Podemos in Spain. They've been like targeted with lawfare and just media defamation, like very much so. And Mélenchon, like what just happened in France is like, okay, they won, and then they're like, oh, actually, we're not gonna bring you into government, right? Which is like what? And so I think that's one side to it. And I think as we critique and learn from these movements, and we advance our politics from these movements, we have to take that into account and not just say, oh, no, these are just, this didn't happen. No, the lawfare did happen. But then the other thing, I think, which is part of what I try to argue in the piece, is that, social democracy fails not just because of lawfare, but because its project is fundamentally incomplete, as it has always been, right? It's a project that, because in many ways it abandons sort of the internationalist angle, right? The colonial question, which in this case comes through the migrant question within Europe, apart from, questions about, foreign policy and all of these things, which are very important, obviously. Because it fails on that, I think Europe's majorities realize that it's a bankrupt project, because really it's holding on to a dream that is no longer feasible. And people are realizing, actually, fascism's analysis is more correct than social democracy's, right? Because in the sense that they are addressing the key question that is affecting European societies, which is immigration, right? And how that is, stirring up the racial panics, the racial contours of European identity, of class collaboration, of the social peace arrangements of the post-war era, et cetera, while social democracy is not addressing that. Social democracy is just kind of suggesting, oh, let's do a little bit of internal core redistribution, and let's do some social policies, and maybe like that, we'll be fine and go back to the golden era, to the golden days, right? And so I think as we have, lived under social democracy and I guess tried social democracy in this particular period for a while, it is up to us to advance that critique, right? And based on that critique, formulate other ways of addressing the conjuncture, basically, because it's not been effective. And just to give you an example, right? Like I live in Spain. I've lived in Spain for a while. We've had, the most progressive government in history, they call themselves, which is kind of funny. But in this period, rent prices have gone crazy, right? Like one of the things that happens in Spain, for example, is that people can't move out from their parents' place, right? Because we don't have the money to move out. And so people stay in their parents' place until you're 30. That's one example, right? But during this period, yes, you have some symbolic measures like Pedro Sanchez on, like Palestine now and everything, which, he's milking electorally, of course, because that's what, symbolic measures with Democrats do. It's still relevant. It still has some importance, but beyond that, the living conditions of the majority of people have gone worse, right? And so I think we realize, especially when you've experienced them in power, is that, it's a bankrupt project. Ultimately, it has no way of affecting the type of change that it kind of used and absorbed in the post-crisis moment, right? And so I think it is up to us to have that clarity on the role of the social democratic project in the core, and how it not only, abdicates any type of internationalism on, the South's national question, et cetera, but how it also fails to deliver, the demands of the people of the people actually in those countries that vote for them, right? It fails to deliver on that. And that's an important thing to have in mind, so that we advance our analysis of, how we essentially relate to the political situation. So I don't know if I answered your question. I think so. I think we're in a moment to go back to the perceived, perhaps, weakness of a communist movement or some sort of farther left element. I think we're in a moment, from where I'm standing, we're in a moment of sort of understanding the role of that social democracy has played, and then moving past it, right? And this is something that is very specific to our particular societies in Europe, because in the US, social democracy hasn't even had any, sort of room to actually be critiqued, right? And so I think, but I think it's key to have this clarity, and from that clarity build a sort of an analysis, and then an organizing, and at the same time an organizing that deals with this in a way that does not incur into the same mistakes that these have shown.
I guess my concluding question is, there something that Europeans also share altogether is a superpower dominating their economies and politics, which is the US, obviously. That and such to the point where a suicidal proxy war, suicidal in the sense that it was designed to destroy a country, to destroy the country it's supposedly waging it, which is to say Ukraine. That this war, for instance, a Ukraine war, which didn't have to happen, which, was like manufactured for the benefit of the US in the sense of bleeding Russia. That like Europe on a dime, as if like an order came down from corporate headquarters, like completely went to full economic war with their Eastern Asian neighbor, and potentially their most logical source of energy. But since that's not allowed, since Russian energy is not allowed to flow through Europe, it's been decided, and that the Germans did this audacious thing of building Nord Stream, and look what they got for it. Like, my question is like, as a European, like, is there any even acknowledgement of how like cucked Europeans are to Uncle Sam? Like, it's, I mean, Germans pretend it's not there. They're like, oh, what 10,000 troops? What air bases? What? Like, that didn't, because it's part of their own, like Vergangenheitsbewältigung, blah, 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 guilt for the war, accepting rich, I don't know, something, who knows? But like, in your corners of Europe, like, do people actually like recognize the vassalhood of all of these countries?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, there's a big critique on the left of NATO, and just how that just subdues us to all of these things, to a point where now it's just becoming like outright irrational, right? Like, why are we following all of these things? I think we're in an interesting sort of moment here, because what I think is happening right now is a sort of internal restructuring of the triad, right? Which is, there's a piece that I have coming out soon on the militaristic sort of moment here in Europe. but kind of like a restructuring of the triad. How basically now you have this sort of these calls for strategic autonomy, right? And it's like, oh, we've been so under Uncle Sam, now they're gonna, he's gonna abandon us, and so we need the strategic autonomy, right? And so I think one of the ways this could be interpreted is like, oh, Europe is finally waking up to its vassalhood, and now it wants, as the French have always been saying this because they have this particular history, and so we're waking up to it, and now we're going to be actually more autonomous. And I think in this whole militaristic discourse, there's no real like questioning of the NATO alliance, of the triad, of the sort of US umbrella. Rather, there's, I think, what is a way of, theatrically reinforce the power of the triad by allowing the EU to rearm through, again, theatrical games, which is like, oh, we're going to be abandoned, right? And it's like, no, you're not going to be abandoned, right? Like, you just want to invest more in arms so you can counter the rise of the South and the East. Like, that's what you want to do, right? And you have troubles all over West Africa, and you have troubles all over the world now to like enforce your monopolies in access to resources and labor and all of that. So I think, there is this discourse that can even be sort of co-opted by European ruling classes about like, oh, we've been too much of a vassal. Now, we can't confuse that with an actual understanding of the vassalage that we have, because what they're doing is using that discourse, which is just a core reality, that it's a vassal sort of formation, to reinforce sort of the wider net of imperial power, right? Because ultimately the U.S. is saying, hey, and Trump has been saying, again, I think in a more correct analysis than Democrats or liberals in the U.S., he's saying like, hey, y'all gotta wake up, because we have like important threats across the world, and like we need your militaries too, right? Like, we can't deal with this by ourselves anymore because we can't. And so this discourse is used to shore up sort of the strength of the core in this context, I think.
I mean, how do you leave the American world system at this point if you're like a European dude? Like, you're the first foreign language you learned was English. Like, the culture you consume more than likely was Hollywood. Like, your diet, your social, your news information, your like the what apps you connect on, the technology, like those are all, I mean, sure, they're sourced from different countries, but they came through the Western system. So even though like Europe, I mean, at the end of the day, Europe doesn't exist, right? It's called Eurasia. It doesn't actually exist. Europe is just an idea. It's like a brand. It's a legal wall. It's like the Great Wall of Europe, and it just exists in their heads, and it's called first and foremost Europe. Whereas if they really wanted to, they could eject the US. I mean, obviously, the US would destroy every inch of Europe like they did before, at least to Germany. But then they could leave that and connect to China, which is like they share a continent with. They could connect to Russia. Like, everything that they could ever need is one Belt and Road train ride away if they wanted it. It's like the Field of Dreams thing. Like, if you build it, like, they will come. But America would nuke every single European parliament, like, out in the open. It would be like Independence Day. They would just arrive slowly in B-52s, like, put an American flag and just drop bombs if that ever happened, because that you're not allowed to break from Uncle Sam. So it's so, I mean, more likely for me, at least at this point, is that you have a collapse of Uncle Sam's power from its own, like ecological and economic and resource acquisitions, whatever. And so it's just a kind of recession from Europe, and like, well, and then other native forces come and try to take their place, and they fight over it. That's the only scenario I could really see, because like a German's going to rise up and like kill the troops. Like, they're going to send their like recruit, like they're going to invade Ramstein. Like, that's not going to happen. Like, like all those bases in the UK, like Brits are going to, like, it's no, this is like one integrated, like supranational empire, and it's a Frontex state, and it's managed through various nodes, economically, politically, militarily, and those nodes are like in, not in Europe, they're elsewhere, and like that's part of it, and that's just the game. And even like this whole weapons thing is basically like what they do to the Arab pedocrat states. Like it's just a wealth jack. They're like, here, spend some money on some useless fucking planes that will fly into a toilet probably one day, that will like, so that's also part of like American gangster imperialism. Is just extractive. And so I don't know. I wonder about how these things go. But Iker, it's been almost an hour. This was a great conversation. I enjoyed it. Your thoroughly depressing piece notwithstanding. I learned a lot. I appreciated it. What do you have cooking? What's coming next from you?
Yeah, so I have, as I mentioned, I have this piece on militarism in Europe, and part of the argument I kind of told here, but I'm kind of trying to ground it, just like in this piece. I try to ground the analysis of the rise of fascism in the rise of the core periphery contradiction, right? So some Moyo Parisieros, Provincia, they talk about the maturation, how the contradiction matures, right? And it's a historical problem, right? Like it's not static; it's something that comes with, the achievement of political sovereignty regimes, the developmental sort of states, the aftermath of neoliberalism, and all of these things. As this thing rises, it creates particular contradictions for the core. One of them is the migrant question, and the other one is militarization on a more conventional level, not just the Frontex, but the one that is happening now. And so I try to sort of bring that analysis and go beyond, the analyses of militarism that are, very much like, we have an accumulation problem, right? We have the fall of the rate of profit, et cetera, et cetera. That is very much like economistic in a way, because it doesn't take into account like what's going on. And I try to go beyond that and try to ground it in the social forces globally, right? And how these affect sort of these dynamics. So that's going to come out. I don't know exactly when. I think maybe September or so. It was for a conference at Vassalhood University. And so we're going to publish it there. And yeah, so that's what's coming.
Thanks very much, Iker. Thank you for your time. Looking forward to having
Absolutely.
you on
It was a
again
pleasure.
sometime.
Yes. Thank you so much. And thank you for all your work. It's been great. Learned a lot, you basically trained
Uh,
me.
I have
So much
no.
appreciation.
Thank you. I'm very honored. Thank you, man. Thank you. I'm going to press end record.